Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Patriots, A Short History of Dissent by Ralph Young. Narrated by Tom Perkins. Preface. American Patriots, A Short History of Dissent is a concise overview of the vital role that dissent has played in American history. The United States is a product of dissent, and dissenters have been the catalyst for change from the first days of the Republic. Slavery was ended, women got the vote, unions won the right to organize, minority groups gained their civil rights because American patriots protested and forced the United States to live up to what it had put down on paper. My previous book, Dissent, The History of an American Idea, a comprehensive narrative of 400 years of American history viewed through the lens of dissent, was published in 2015. In the past 8 years, dissent has exploded at an exponential pace and in unexpected directions. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, March for Our Lives, and climate activism are all responses to the real problems of racism, sexism, gun violence, and the threat that climate change poses to all of us living on this planet. These are significant issues that need to be addressed. There has also been considerable faux dissent that has not targeted actual injustices but is grounded in an upsurge of lies, conspiracy theories, and disinformation spread by web-based propagandists, disaffected reactionaries, and even the President of the United States. The events of the Trump years, the election of 2020 and the January 6, 2021 storming of the Capitol captured the headlines and compelled me to re-examine the definition, scope, and future of American dissent. Dissenters have always challenged existing reality, the way things are, and pushed those in power to make changes. Historically, such dissent against the status quo was, in essence, apolitical, in that it has come from both the right and the left. Actual grievances were actual grievances, not political spin. Dissent was not the property of a political party. It transcended politics, even though politics was often the means that was used to redress those grievances. So, is it dissent if one is protesting against an injustice that does not exist? If one is motivated by lies, disinformation, and conspiracy theories? If one is fighting a delusion? No. Perhaps a psychologist would have a term for it. But some of what has transpired over the past few years is certainly not dissent. It can be more accurately categorized as synthetic dissent. What does this mean for the future of dissent in America? My goal with American Patriots is to provide an accessible overview for both the historian and the general listener of how dissent has been a key factor in shaping the United States, especially after the advent of such technological advances in the 20th century as the phonograph, radio, TV, the Internet, and social media that has made it possible and certainly easier for dissenters to disseminate their message and win converts to their cause. So, this book concentrates on the last 100-plus years of American history, when the U.S. emerged as the preeminent and most culturally relevant and influential power on the world stage. Time Life publisher Henry Luce famously called the 20th century America's century. And certainly for better or worse, the U.S. has had an extraordinary impact on world affairs, even as it is in decline. The first chapter of American Patriots highlights the historical context and some of the most influential individuals who advanced the philosophy of dissent from the colonial period to the Gilded Age. Then, starting with the 20th century, I explore the details of the struggles for workers' rights, women's rights, civil rights, and indeed all the minority rights movements, as well as the anti-war movements that have dominated public discourse for more than a century. These chapters are updated and thoroughly revised versions of material that appeared in Dissent, The History of an American Idea. Chapter 11 and the conclusion focus on the enormous number of protests that have taken place since 2015. Despite the fact that the United States considers itself the most influential, inclusive democracy in the world, the early years of the 21st century have seen massive protests that challenge that perception. Millions of Americans took to the streets protesting the police killing of unarmed African Americans, sexism, unchecked environmental destruction, gun violence, white supremacy, critical race theory, censorship in public education, and the controversial decisions of a politicized Supreme Court. Meanwhile, other protests based on disinformation, fabrications, and conspiracy theories have deliberately added a fog of bewilderment to an already volatile atmosphere. And all of this, in the Internet age, has been amplified by an unregulated social media that publicizes causes, both real and imagined, recruits adherents, develops strategies, and organizes demonstrations, protests, insurrections. It is imperative for concerned citizens to closely analyze how dissent is practiced in this country as we go forward into the rest of the 21st century. We have to continue to scrutinize dissent movements in order to understand if they express legitimate grievances or act as a smokescreen for those who are more interested in undermining democracy and thwarting its extension to the disempowered in order to bolster their own self-centered interests. The right to dissent is central to democracy, but we must protect that right and ensure it as the means of our salvation and not our ruin. Introduction. Dissent and America. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Henry David Thoreau, Walden Pond, 1854. All we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. Martin Luther King, Jr., Memphis, April 3, 1968. There are many ways to tell the story of the United States, many possible perspectives. This is the story of the U.S. told through a somewhat unlikely assortment of voices. It is the story of a countless number of Americans who prodded, provoked, and pushed the United States to actually be the nation it imagined itself to be. Throughout these stories runs the thread of dissent, protest, conflict, and change. American Patriots is the personal reflection of a historian on the centrality of dissent in American history. Of course, dissent is not specific to America, but Americans have instinctively understood, even if mostly unconsciously, the interrelatedness of dissent and what it means to be an American. Dissent created this nation, and it played, indeed still plays, a fundamental role in fomenting change and pushing the nation in sometimes unexpected directions. My goal has been to write the story of the United States from the standpoint of those who did not see eye to eye with the powers that be, from the standpoint of those who marched to the beat of a different drummer, constantly challenging the government to fulfill the promise laid down in the nation's founding documents. There has not been a time in American history when dissenters have not spoken out against the powerful and entrenched interests. At the same time, there were many occasions when dissenters against the dissenters fought ever harder to maintain or restore a social order that they feared would vanish if dissenters had their way. And so dissent did not propel the United States on a steady path toward the progress that dissenters sought. It was a rocky road. Dissent is one of this nation's defining characteristics. Every decade, since the earliest days of colonization, Americans have protested for just about every cause imaginable. And every time they did, defenders of the status quo denounced the protesters as unpatriotic, and in more recent times as un-American. But protest is one of the consummate expressions of Americanness. It is patriotic in the deepest sense. Even before the United States was conceived, there was dissent. During the 17th century, religious dissent played a significant role in the planting and development of the English colonies. In the 18th century, political dissent led to the open rebellion that resulted in the birth of the United States. In the 19th century, dissenters demanded the abolition of slavery, suffrage for women, fair treatment of Native Americans, and the banning of immigrants. And they protested against the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War on both sides, and the Spanish-American War. In the 20th century, dissenters organized to prohibit alcohol, but also demanded workers' rights, women's rights, African American rights, Chicano rights, reproductive rights, and LGBTQ+ rights. They also protested against every war, declared and undeclared, fought by the United States. In the 21st century, dissenters have protested against abortion, NAFTA, globalization, the Iraq War, the Patriot Act, the National Security Agency, bank bailouts, and out-of-control deficits. Most recently, dissenters have mobilized to protest against systemic racism, sexual harassment and assault, and Congress's inability or refusal to enact meaningful legislation to address climate change and gun violence. And then there are those who, despite their real grievances, having fallen for the widespread disinformation circulating on untrustworthy Internet sites, raise their voices in protest on the basis of conspiracy theories, lies, and a distorted view of American history. Clearly, dissent has many faces. On the broadest level, dissent is going against the grain. It is speaking out and protesting against what is, whatever that is, most often by a minority group unhappy with majority opinion and rule. However, history has shown that dissent is far more complex, that it comes from all political perspectives and in a variety of categories, mostly religious, political, economic, and cultural/social. Religious dissent is the insistence that everyone be allowed to worship according to the dictates of conscience and not according to the rules of an established religion. Although most religious dissent occurred during the colonial period, when individuals insisted on religious liberty, and during the early national period when the new nation endorsed the principle of separation of church and state, the demand for religious autonomy persists to this day. Religious dissent was expressed when new sects such as the Shakers, the Mormons, or the Branch Davidians were formed, and it is still being expressed on a different level in the debates over school prayer, intelligent design versus evolution, abortion, capital punishment, and the right to die. Political dissent is a critique of governance. As the United States grew from a fledgling nation into a world power, political dissenters expressed dissatisfaction about the way those who were in charge governed, and usually, but not always, they provided a plan or recipe for redressing what they perceived as wrong. Most often, they used the nation's founding documents as the authority to legitimize their protest. Antebellum abolitionists demanded the end of slavery, declaring that holding persons in bondage was contrary to the principle that all men are created equal. In recent years, hundreds of thousands of Americans protested the decision to invade Iraq, proclaiming that doing so transforms the United States into an aggressive imperial power, and that by embracing imperialism, the United States is renouncing its democratic birthright. When the economy crashes, economic dissent comes to the fore. People take to the streets protesting economic injustice and inequality. And as distress and suffering expands from the lower classes to the middle class, so too does protest. One thinks of the Richmond bread riots during the Civil War, the violent labor disputes of the 19th century, the bonus army's encampment at the Capitol in 1932, the militant labor activism during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's liberal presidency, the tax revolts of the 1970s, the occupation of Zuccotti Park in 2011. Cultural and social dissent is a rejection of the predominant attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of mainstream society. Utopian groups in the 19th century defied the conventional values of their time and established communities where all men and women would be treated equally. Beatniks and hippies in the mid-20th century rejected the conventional middle-class morality of their time, urged their fellow Americans to do their own thing, and influenced millions to reevaluate their views of race, gender, and sexuality. But this is only part of the story. There is significant and frequent overlapping of religious, political, and cultural/social dissent. For example, many dissenters, such as temperance activists in the early 20th century and the Christian right today, can be labeled as political, religious, and social dissenters. The 1960s counterculture's challenge to American values was also intricately tied up in the political protests against the Vietnam War and the struggle for racial equality. Furthermore, there are economic and psychological factors that often play roles in dissent movements. There are some decades that are relatively quiet dissent-wise, and others when significant problems intensify so rapidly that tens of millions of people get involved in the discussion to find solutions. During these periods we see a sharp rise in dissent, and that dissent can take many forms as different groups propose different solutions. Some dissenters are reformers who wish to fix the problems through a process of reform. Some are reactionaries who seek to address the problems by returning to the policies that existed before the problems arose. Some are radicals or even revolutionaries who propose to solve the problems by smashing the system and starting over. The debate over slavery and the events leading to the Civil War, the Progressive Era, and the 1960s, and the present day are periods when dissent in all its diverse forms exploded. There are several levels or stages of dissent. At the beginning, individuals might simply disagree with a policy or a law or an issue. Perhaps they are willing to tolerate a wrong or an injustice for a while, but when it becomes less tolerable, the next step is to become active. Individuals might write a letter or an article, give a speech, lead a protest march, or conduct a demonstration. Dissent and protest carried to a higher level entails resistance, civil disobedience, breaking laws, or even participating in a riot or insurrection. The methods and forms of dissent are wide-ranging. Many protesters express dissent through petitions and protest marches. Some use music or art or theater or comedy to articulate their message. Some engage in acts of civil disobedience, willfully breaking laws to put pressure on the system to force those who have political and economic power to acknowledge and address the issues. They are often marginalized individuals and groups that lack power but have a legitimate grievance against the way things are. Most times these types of dissenters have criticized the United States from the left. They have sought more equality, more moral rectitude, more freedom. They have demanded that America live up to what it had committed itself to on paper at the Constitutional Convention. Many of these dissenters have viewed the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as binding contracts between the people and the government, and protested when they believed the government was not fulfilling its part of the contract. Dissenters often have a keen sense of history and build on the experiences and methods of earlier dissenters. It is not unusual to see dissenters quote those who have gone before as well as draw on the successful tactics and strategies of earlier dissent movements. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s employed many of the tactics of the labor movement of the 1930s, while anti-war activists adopted the tactics of the civil rights movement in their protests against the war in Vietnam and later the Iraq War. Dissenters with a vision for the future look to the past for inspiration. But there are some dissenters who have a sketchy understanding of American history who want to return to an imagined past that never existed. For example, those who protest against immigration in order to keep America white, not realizing that the country has always been a nation of diversity, peopled by immigrants of all ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s opposing anyone who was not 100% American, and the Unite the Right protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 chanting, "You will not replace us," are examples of this. Individuals and groups that protest against the protesters are also expressing dissent. Reactionaries have frequently resisted change and fought to maintain the special privileges and supremacy of their class or race or gender. Some have wanted to maintain the status quo and prevent change, while others have sought to turn back the clock to a simpler, more trouble-free time. When abolitionists denounced slavery, anti-abolitionists argued just as passionately to preserve the institution. When women demanded equality, millions of Americans reacted with hostility and formed anti-suffrage associations. Although most dissent springs from those who lack political power, There are instances when a dissent movement is part of the power structure. The temperance movement and the know-nothings of the 19th century, the anti-tax ideologues of the 20th and 21st centuries. There are also notable individuals who fought entrenched interests from a position of political power. Senators Robert M. La Follette and Margaret Chase Smith, for example, spoke out against what they believed was a usurpation or misuse of power on the part of the federal government. Over the years, dissenters achieved varying levels of success. Some got in trouble, some were arrested, many were beaten, some were killed. But they kept hammering away at the powers that be until those powers began to listen. As a result, public opinion was swayed, laws were enacted or repealed, slavery was abolished, unions were organized, women got the right to vote, the Jim Crow laws were invalidated. In fact, many dissenters who were maligned, vilified, and even demonized as unpatriotic and anti-American by their contemporaries are now considered heroes. Some dissenters never achieved the change they were seeking, but though their goals were dismissed, they raised new questions and had an influence on the political discussion. For the most part, dissenters have embraced lofty ideals and have a moral purpose, and most of them believe they are acting to ensure that the United States lives up to its promise to secure Americans' natural rights. But there are dissenters whose goals are not well-intended or virtuous, and who use questionable means to attain their goals. They are not in it to grant equal rights to a downtrodden minority, but to restrict rights or to promote their own narrow interests at the expense of others. During times of heightened passions, the antebellum period, the Progressive Era, the Great Depression, the Vietnam War, dissenters have protested from liberal, conservative, and radical standpoints. In the debates about the war in Vietnam, for example, there were those who believed that America was acting as an imperial power and that the capitalist system should be toppled. There were those who opposed the war primarily on ethical grounds because the United States was acting immorally. And there were those who opposed the war simply because the United States was losing it, and thus argued that if the government was not going to go all out in its effort to destroy communism in Vietnam, then there was no point in being there. In the end, for completely different reasons, radicals, doves, and hawks all came to protest the war in Vietnam. Obviously, not all dissenters are created equal, nor are the consequences of their efforts necessarily positive or socially useful. There is a difference between dissenters whose goal is to create a more just society by expanding the rights of the disempowered, and those who are self-aggrandizing troublemakers, interested only in disrupting society or denying rights to others. Historian Eric Foner, in The Story of American Freedom, points out that freedom is a contested concept. So too is dissent. 1. Dissent and the Shaping of a Nation. As I stood, considering the walls of solid stone 2 or 3 feet thick, the door of wood and iron a foot thick, and the iron grating which strained the light, I could not help being struck with the foolishness of that institution which treated me as if I were mere flesh and blood and bones to be locked up. I saw that if there was a wall of stone between me and my townsmen, there was a still more difficult one to climb or break through before they could get to be as free as I was. I did not for a moment feel confined, and the walls seemed a great waste of stone and mortar. I saw that the state was half-witted, and that it did not know its friends from its foes, and I lost all my remaining respect for it, and pitied it. Henry David Thoreau, Resistance to Civil Government, 1847. After more than a century of conflict with and exploitation of the First Nations of the New World, Spain had successfully established scores of missions and permanent colonies from Florida to California, while French explorers and missionaries were setting up outposts along the St. Lawrence River. Into this volatile mix of cultures, thousands of English colonists began in the early 17th century to establish permanent settlements along the east coast of North America. Most were seeking economic opportunity, but many, especially those settling in New England, were religious dissenters. Almost as soon as these religious dissenters arrived in New England, dissidents rose up to challenge them. Although the Puritans were religious dissenters, they did not come to the New World for the noble cause of religious freedom. What the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Colony were seeking was to practice what they regarded as the one true faith, not freedom for all religions. They did not favor religious toleration, as anyone entering the colony wishing to worship according to a false belief system quickly discovered. Those who did not see eye to eye with the colony's authorities found themselves ostracized and banished. It was Roger Williams, arriving in Massachusetts Bay in 1631, who pushed for religious freedom. Williams, one of the first dissenters in the English colonies, took exception to several tenets of the Puritan oligarchy. He called for the complete separation of church and state and for religious toleration. Williams argued that to compel people to conform to a specific authorized religious belief was counterproductive, because it simply convinced them that a belief that had to be imposed must be false. If governing officials seek to enforce one religion in a society, then they obviously have to punish those who refuse to accept the authorized religion. A civil sword, meaning the punishment that civil authorities must use to enforce conformity of religion, Williams argued with impeccable logic, is so far from bringing or helping forward an opposite in religion to repentance that magistrates sin grievously against the work of God and blood of souls by such proceedings. Violence and a sword of steel begets such an impression in the sufferers that certainly they conclude that religion cannot be true which needs such instruments of violence to uphold it so. Regarding separation of church and state, Williams maintained that it is imperative to keep a well-defined distinction between the two to protect freedom of religion. If there were too much blurring of the lines between church and state, both institutions would be endangered, but worst of all, it would mean religion would have to be sanctioned by the state. And as far as Williams was concerned, he did not want the colony to have, like the nations of Europe, an established religion. Religious belief should not be dependent on the whim of a monarch. Magistrates, he insisted, have no power of setting up the form of church government, electing church officers, or punishing with church censures. Likewise, the churches as churches have no power of erecting or altering forms of civil government, electing of civil officers, inflicting civil punishments. In the end, Williams's dissension led to his banishment. He established a new colony, Providence, that became a haven for those who held unpopular views. Over the next century and a half, as the colonial settlements grew increasingly diverse and multicultural, Williams's advocacy of toleration and the separation of church and state became a fundamental part of 18th-century political discourse. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, these principles were regarded as natural rights and were included in the Bill of Rights. Another significant act of dissent during the colonial period that had long-lasting repercussions was newspaper publisher John Peter Zenger's protest against political corruption in New York. In November 1733, Zenger's paper, the New York Weekly Journal, began running a series of articles scathingly denouncing Governor William Cosby for his corrupt administration of the colony. It was public knowledge that Cosby was bribing legislators and judges, embezzling funds from the colony's treasury, and falsifying election results. The journal argued that freedom of the press was necessary because the press was the only institution that could serve as a watchdog against political corruption and the misuse of power. Zenger maintained that if the magistrates and rulers were not held accountable to the law and for their actions, then Britain and its colonies had not progressed at all from the absolutism of the Tudors. If men in power were always men of integrity, he wrote, we might venture to trust them with the direction of the press, and there would be no occasion to plead against the restraint of it. But men are corruptible, and therefore a free press is essential to keep them in check. If freedom of the press and freedom of speech were restricted, liberty itself would be snuffed out. Governor Cosby ordered the publisher's arrest on charges of seditious libel and had the newspaper shut down. According to 18th-century British law, it was only necessary to prove that Zenger had published the articles in order to obtain a conviction. The question of whether Zenger's
Sample complete. Ready to continue?